Hello, my name is James Nagy. Thank you for watching my video series, The End of the End Times. This is part 6 of my presentation, which is a 10-part series based upon my book, also titled The End of the End Times. Well, now we come to the Roman Empire. This lesson should really be thought of as the climax of the story of the nation of Israel. We're going to come to a series of events that are going to forever shape the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, the temple worship, and just really the religious way of life for the Jewish people. And recall that from the book of Daniel, we've been looking at 4 beasts. We started with Assyria, but Assyria is not one of the beasts mentioned in the book of Daniel. But now we come to the Roman Empire, or the 4th beast, which is mentioned in Daniel. And the passage goes like this. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Well, I hope you stay tuned to this presentation because we're going to talk about the identity of the 10 horns. There's a lot of speculation about who the horns are, and we're going to see by studying the history of both Rome and Israel, as well as looking at some passages in Matthew and the book of Revelation, we're going to discover who the identity of the 10 horns are shortly, so just hold on for that. Well, more history. Now, when we study prophecy in the New Testament, we're really going to focus on Matthew 24 and some passages in the book of Revelation. It is absolutely crucial that we have some historical context in order to assist in our analysis of the prophecies, particularly in the New Testament, as I said. So we're going to look at a timeline here, and we're not trying to memorize all of the names of the Roman emperors here and all of the people, but this is really for your reference. If you haven't done so yet, I would encourage you to go to my website, www.theendoftheendtimes.com. Print out this timeline because we're going to refer back to it from time to time. And if you don't have it now, make sure you have the chart that shows the Hasmonean Dynasty because we're going to refer to that quite a bit in this lesson too. So a couple key points really we're going to look at here. Recall that we've been talking about the Hasmonean Dynasty. We talked about the Hasmonean Dynasty in the last lesson when we studied Greece, and we're going to look at it again. Now the Hasmonean Dynasty was a kingly dynasty. Well, I should correct myself. There were actually queens, a queen who ruled over the nation of Israel for a time. So let's really think of it as a dynasty of kings and queens, Jewish kings and queens, who ruled over the nation. And over time, the nation of Israel grew weaker because of infighting and influences of the surrounding nations. Now, the Hasmonean Dynasty ended in 37 BC. We talked about this, I believe, 2 lessons ago, with the death of Antigonus II. And this event occurred 483 years, or 69 weeks, after the Darius decree. And as I told you, I'm not here to tell you how you should interpret the Daniel passage. I think it's rather remarkable that we have 2 events that we can point to. One, if we start with the Artaxerxes decree in Daniel 9, then that lands us at about the time of the beginning of Jesus' ministry. But we also have another strong contender for who the anointed one was. And as I said, if we start with the Darius decree, then if we add 69 weeks to that date, that lands us right at 37 BC with the death of King Antigonus. And this marks the end of the Hasmonean Dynasty and the kingly rule of Israel forever and ever. Humanly speaking, of course, because we know that Lord Jesus is on the throne. Well, after the death of Antigonus, Herod the Great became king of Judea, and this includes the nation of Israel, of course. And we know from the book of Matthew that Herod tried to kill all of the male children in Bethlehem under the age of 2 in a vain attempt to kill the Messiah. And you can see here Herod's reign. I have it shown here roughly 37 BC, and his reign goes to a little bit before AD 0, before the year of 0. And about that time, during that time, Augustus, who was Octavian. He was a Roman leader named Octavian. He goes on to become Augustus Caesar, and he is the first emperor of the Roman Empire. And there's a point to this, I promise you, we'll get to it. So if you look at the timeline here, I show, I think most of the emperors beginning with Augustus. You can see Tiberius, who was the emperor during the time of Jesus, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, and Titus, and there's a few others in there that I haven't shown, but just to kind of get a general reference or idea of who was emperor during the time of key events. So for example, during Paul's ministry, during Jesus' ministry, and during the 7-year Roman-Jewish war that we're going to talk about extensively in this lesson and in the next. So this is really more of a reference slide. There's not going to be a quiz. But a point here, the Jewish temple and Jerusalem are completely destroyed by Roman legions in a 7-year war with Rome from AD 66 to 73. And you can see that in the timeline here. If you look at the year AD 70, you can see I've got a block of time out there carved out to depict the 7-year Roman-Jewish war. And another point I want to make here in this slide is that from the time of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, until the time that the temple is destroyed in AD 70, there are a total of 10 Roman emperors, or 10 horns. We'll talk about that a little bit from now. Well, here's our slide again of the Hasmonean Dynasty. A couple of points that I want to make with regard to this slide and some of the people involved. Very interesting bit of Jewish history that most people are probably not familiar with. In one of my previous lessons, I talked about a man named John Hyrcanus, who was the son of Simon Maccabees, and he fought against the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic empires to the north and the south. And in doing this, he helped to maintain Jewish independence during the time of the Greek Empire, specifically during the Seleucid reign. And in order to preserve regional independence, John Hyrcanus subdued the Idumeans, who were also known as the Edomites, and forced them to convert to Judaism. All right, so hold that thought for a minute because this is actually going to figure in Jewish history. It actually has a point, so bear with me. Well, if you look at the chart of people in blue, because we're talking about the Hasmoneans, we have a man named Alexander Jannaeus, who was the son of Hyrcanus. Well, Alexander Jannaeus has two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. After the death of Alexander Jannaeus, then Queen Salome Alexandra puts Aristobulus in the position of political leader and the son Hyrcanus in the position of high priest. So this is simply a case of the royal family putting friends and family into key positions in the government in order to maintain political power. So again, we have Aristobulus, who is a political leader, and Hyrcanus II, who is the high priest. A little bit later, on the advice of an Idumean, again, remember these are formerly the Edomites, and again, very important, recall that the Idumeans had converted to Judaism. So on the advice of an Idumean named Antipater, Hyrcanus was encouraged or coerced or talked into fighting against his brother Aristobulus. So now you have these two brothers in very high positions in the Jewish government, and they begin to fight against each other. Well, after a time, the fighting comes to a standstill, and so the brothers appealed to the Roman leader Pompey to settle the matter of who should lead the nation. Should it be Aristobulus or should it be Hyrcanus II? At this time, there's a very famous series of battles going on at this time. Pompey, it turns out, happened to be in the east, and he was subduing pirates that were attacking the Mediterranean cities that were probably Roman cities at the time. This is occurring from 66 to 62 BC. And on his return to Rome, he is petitioned to settle the matter of who should rule Israel. So Pompey then imprisons Aristobulus and installs Hyrcanus as a puppet leader. So now we have a Roman puppet leader of the Jewish nation. And this is Hyrcanus II. Now we're going to get to the rise of Herod the Great. And this is where all these events all merge together and they result in some very unforeseen events that are going to forever shape Israel. Well, keep that chart in hand if you have it. Now, Hyrcanus had a daughter, Salome Alexandra, who married Alexander, the son of Aristobulus. So remember these two brothers that are at each other's throats. Hyrcanus has a daughter, Aristobulus has a son, Alexander, and together the two cousins marry, and they have a daughter, Miriam. Miriam would go on to marry a man named Herod, who was the son of Antipater, the Idumean who convinced Hyrcanus to fight against his brother. This Herod would go on to become Herod the Great, the man who would one day murder all the male children in Bethlehem in a vain attempt to murder Lord Jesus. So, Herod then goes on to found the Herodian dynasty, which brings an end to the Hasmonean dynasty that started with the Hasmoneans 100 years earlier. Herod was a very cruel and very distrustful man. He trusted no one, and this included his wife, and eventually he has his wife murdered. He also suffered from distemper and convulsions and died a horrible death as foretold in Daniel chapter 8, verses 23 through 25. Now, Herod did a couple of good things, interestingly enough, despite the fact that he was a very wicked and selfish man. He built the city of Caesarea. He furnished the Jewish temple and provided an outlay of funding for the Olympic Games, which nearly ended for lack of money. It's quite possible that today we might not even have the Olympic Games were it not for the fact that King Herod provided money in order to perpetuate the Olympic Games. So despite his cruelty and wickedness, we at least have him to thank for this. Now, the reasons for the rebellion. Now we're going to see that over time the Jewish nation is going to tire of the Roman leaders, and eventually we're going to end up in full-scale war between Israel and Rome. And let's look at the events that precipitated all this. So Emperor Caligula, now he ruled Rome from AD 37 to 41. He was determined to place a statue of himself in the Jewish temple. Caligula dispatched General Petronius and 3 legions of soldiers to accomplish this task. Petronius soon realized that the Jews would rather be murdered before they would allow this to ever take place. So the Jewish nation was growing weary of the strain of Roman rule during Emperor Nero, who ruled from AD 54 to 68. So we have another Roman emperor that was kind of antagonistic toward the Jewish people. And it's during Emperor Nero particularly that we begin to see a rise of great evil and an increase in the seditious men who created uprisings against Rome. And we are going to look at the Zealots, the Jewish Zealots who were interested in promoting first century Judaism. We're also going to talk about the Sicarii, so named for the Sika, or the dagger that they used to promote terrorism. So we had these terrorist elements in the Jewish community that were trying to subvert the attempts of Rome to completely control their nation. So this is all going on during a period of different Roman emperors. Now in AD 64 to 66, we have a man named Gessius Florus. He is the procurator of Judea. And this man, he's Roman. So Gessius Florus is continually trying to provoke the Jews to violence. He was a wicked man by all accounts. He was a lover of money, and he also took money from the temple, and he gave license for thievery in the Jewish cities. So he actually told the Jews themselves that they could engage in thievery and there would be no consequences for this. So, and by all accounts, he was just kind of a rebel leader and an anarchist who was just trying to incite the Jews to hostilities. At this time, Agrippa II appealed to the Jews for forbearance. And he pleaded with them. He said, look, I realize this is going on with the Roman leaders, the Roman leaders who are over Judea and over Israel. He says, but they are a hopelessly superior army. There is no way you can fight a prolonged war against Rome. So he urged them to engage in forbearance. But by this time, the Jews were tiring of the Roman leaders, and the Jews actually drove Agrippa II out of the city and with stones, and they marched on to Masada, where they killed the Roman soldiers there. Now, this event marks the beginning of the Roman-Jewish War. So now we are in outright armed hostilities between Rome and Israel. And then shortly after, fighting broke out in several Syrian cities that had Jewish populations. The Jews at Caesarea were slaughtered, and hostilities even broke out all the way down south in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. And I want to read this Bible quote that I have on the slide here. This is from Matthew 24, verse 2 and 34. I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Well, all this violence is going on. By this time, Jesus has died. The resurrection has taken place. But Jesus foretold and he warned the Jewish people, specifically the faithful remnant of Israel. He was warning them of this upcoming war between Rome and Israel. He was trying to tell his disciples, look, certain things are going to happen. When you see these things happen, I want you to know that it's going to get worse. And so Jesus, ahead of time, prepared his people, his followers, for these events that were eventually going to happen between Rome and Israel. So how does Rome respond to the rebellion? Well, we have four men that we're going to look at. The first one was Gessius Florus. He was the procurator of Judea from AD 64 to 66. We talked about him already. He was the man that was continually trying to incite the Jews to violence. We have another man, Cestius Gallus. At the time, he was governor of Syria, and when he saw the hostilities breaking out around Jerusalem, he marched to Jerusalem with an army of 30,000 soldiers, supported by another 14,000 soldiers under the command of Agrippa. The armies of Gallus encompassed Jerusalem. Now, at this point in the hostility, the seditionists were fleeing the city, and Gallus could have easily taken the city. However, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, Gallus withdrew his troops, quote, without any reason in the world. And it's unfortunate that he didn't take the city at that time, because he could have, humanly speaking, prevented what was about to happen. As the war intensified, the people of Damascus slaughtered the Jews living there. And in response to the failure of Cestius Gallus, Nero sent a man by the name of Vespasian, his full Roman name was Titus Flavius Vespasianus, to continue the assaults against Jerusalem. Vespasian had 3 legions under his command, and his son Titus had another legion under his command. So now we have 4 legions of Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, and it's going to get much hotter from this point on. We're going to look at the 2 Jewish seditionist leaders, and we're going to see how their actions really led to the collapse of the entire Jewish nation, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, and ultimately the destruction of the Jewish temple. The first was a man named John of Gischala, and within little time Vespasian had put down the rebels in all of the Jewish towns except for Jerusalem and a town called Gischala. So this is the last holdout of the Jewish seditionists. Titus marched his troops to Gischala, but under the pretense of wanting to celebrate the Sabbath, John asked Titus for a reprieve from the fighting. During the night, John and his band fled to Jerusalem. But John of Gischala, the Jewish leader, left the women and the children behind, and they were slaughtered by the Romans. Once inside Jerusalem, John set himself up as the leader of the rebellion. He used for himself the provisions that were needed for a prolonged conflict. John went to work immediately, murdering anyone who did not follow him. He converted the temple and the sanctuary into a kind of military stronghold. So what's going on here is the Jewish seditionist leaders become just as much an enemy of the people, that is, the people who were not trying to engage in hostilities against Rome, and potentially people that were faithful toward the Lord. Now they really have 2 enemies. They have several enemies within, as well as the Roman legions that they have to contend with, and things, again, are going to get much worse. John of Gischala then dispatched a letter to the Idumeans by claiming falsely that the priesthood was going to surrender to the Romans. Not wanting to see any Jews supporting the Romans, the Idumeans came to Jerusalem and joined in the rebellion. At this point, the Zealots and the Idumeans combined forces, and they began to murder anyone who opposes them. They set up mock trials and murdered innocent people. They defiled the temple and the sanctuary with their own blood whenever wounded from fighting, in fulfillment of Matthew 24, verses 15 through 22. So they're actually defiling the sanctuary with the blood of the people that they murdered. John also gave license to his followers for every form of wanton behavior. He and his followers began to dress and style their hair as women. They applied makeup and walked about the city in an effeminate manner. This is from the accounts from Josephus. At this point, Vespasian could have taken the city, but he decided instead to allow the Jews to murder one another, and he told the Roman soldiers to back off for a time. The second man we're going to look at, the second seditionist leader, is a man named Simon Bar Gioris. Now the people of Jerusalem, weary from John's lawlessness, were fleeing the city and threw their support behind a man named Simon Bar Gioris. He was admitted into the city gates as a liberator along with his followers. Unfortunately, Simon proved to be the more wicked of the two men, and the two factions, that's Simon and John's, began recklessly murdering members of the opposing factions. Simon's army consisted of about 10,000 men, and while Titus laid siege to the city, hundreds of thousands of Jews traveled to Jerusalem from all parts of the world to celebrate the Passover. When they entered the city, John's and Simon's followers fell upon the people and murdered many of them. And this is why we're going to see that so many Jews died during this conflict, is because the final destruction of the city occurs during the Passover, and we have Jews from all over the known world at the time traveling to the city of Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And once they were admitted into the city, many of them were immediately killed. After the war, so we're jumping ahead a little bit, but we'll circle back. After the war, Simon was sent to Rome to be executed. Now, a little bit more of Roman history, and yes, this greatly factors in to this entire discussion, so please follow along closely. In AD 68, the Roman Senate condemned Nero to death. Nero took his own life, leaving no successor, and Rome was immediately plunged into civil war. Vespasian quickly departed for Rome and left his son Titus in charge of the Jewish revolt. So Vespasian went back to Rome. Titus remains in Jerusalem to continue fighting against the Jewish seditionists. From AD 68 to 69, three men, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, would each rule Rome as emperor for a very short period of time. Roman legions ultimately threw their support to Vespasian, and they executed Vitellius, defeated his soldiers, and then Vespasian would go on to become Rome's 9th emperor. This is in fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7, verse 24, if you want to turn there and read it. Well, I have it here, so I'll go ahead and read it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. And again, this is from Daniel 7, verse 24. This is a description that of the 10 kings or rulers, out of one of them, he will put down 3 kings. And I believe that this is a reference to Vespasian ultimately becoming emperor, and Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Each of those, after a time, were murdered. Now, we get to the fall of Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem began in AD 70 and concluded in August of that year. The Romans had built huge towers all around the city from which they could fire arrows into the city. They also were crucifying people outside of the city gates so that the people inside the city of Jerusalem could see people crucified from all parts of the city, outside of the city gates. The famine was very widespread, and in Jerusalem, 1.5 bushels of wheat sold for 20 years of wages. Dead bodies were stacked inside houses because there were so many dead, there was literally no place to put them. And, very importantly, the daily sacrifice ceased on the 17th day of Tammuz, roughly June or July, and this event occurs 3.5 years into the war, for there was no one left to offer it, and this is in fulfillment of Daniel 9, verse 27. Titus, the emperor, as we'll see, he will become emperor, but for a time now, he's still a Roman leader. Titus held a high regard for the Jewish holy places, but he finally relented and acknowledged that they had been converted into military strongholds, and so he ordered the gates of the city to be burned down. Among the items burned were all of the historical records of the Jewish nation. All of the genealogies were burned. during the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And we're going to see why this is a very vital point shortly. Then finally, we get to the Masada, the final Jewish holdout. This is a very interesting event. The 7-year revolt against Rome began in AD 66 with the plundering of the money from the temple by Gessius Florus. The last holdout of Jews occurred at the city fortress of Masada in late AD 73 or possibly early AD 74. This city lies just west of the Dead Sea. Under the command of one Eleazar, one of the zealot leaders, about 1,000 men, women, and children barricaded themselves in the fortress and eventually took their own lives when it became clear that the Romans would enter the city. The account we have that many consider to be the most reliable was that, according to Josephus, each man killed the members of his own family. After a time, 10 men were left to kill all the remaining men, and of all of these, one man would kill the final 10 before taking his own life. Well, how do we know this? Well, allegedly, 2 women and 5 children were hidden during all of these events, and they later gave an account of the events that happened within Masada. The cost of the Jewish War. So let's look at the final cost of the Roman-Jewish War. The fall of Masada marked the end of the 7-year Jewish revolt. According to some accounts, over 1 million Jews were killed and 100,000 were taken prisoner, with many of those ultimately sold into slavery or even killed for sport. Prior to the war, Christian Jews were an integral part of the Jewish community and the synagogue. But after the destruction of the temple, the divide between Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews begins to widen. Jewish rabbis returned to Jerusalem and established cultural and religious centers that became the basis for modern Judaism. Christianity continued to spread to other nations as the Jewish Christians were leaving their Jewish roots behind. So we're starting to see here that the Jewish Christians are starting to abandon the things of the former Jewish culture and religious life, and these Christians would go on to become the church ultimately. But importantly, we have a growing gap or a widening between the Christian Jews and the non-Christian Jews. And then the non-Christian Jews recast a former prayer that called upon the Almighty to destroy their enemies, and this included Christians. So now, after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, we even have hostilities by the non-Christian Jews acting antagonistically toward the Christian Jews. Now we're going to talk about the Second Jewish War, because this is an important event in Roman Jewish history too. And while it's not necessarily vital to the understanding of Bible prophecy, I think it's important that you at least have a little bit of understanding that there was another war that went on between the Jewish nation and Rome. 60 years later, the Jews would again revolt against Rome. This rebellion began under Hadrian, emperor of Rome, who forbade the practice of circumcision and had plans to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman city. The Jews united behind one Shimon ben Kosiba, who was later called Simon bar Kokhba. So sometimes you'll hear either name pronounced or written. And he was referred to as the son of a star. Many believe that Kosiba was the fulfillment of a verse in Numbers, that's chapter 24, verse 17. And one rabbi even proclaimed Kosiba to be the Messiah. The war began in AD 132 and concluded in 135 with the fall of a city called Beitar, which was the final holdout of the Jews. After AD 70, this is the previous Jewish-Roman war, Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. However, after AD 135, the second revolt, Jews were no longer allowed to live in the city. The center of Christian worship in Jerusalem now fell to a line of Gentiles. See, up to this point, the Christian church had been led by Jewish Christians, but now because of the second revolt after 135, the Christian church now is going to be ruled by a line of Gentile men. And the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586. Oh, this is a very interesting point that I want to make. Talking about the three times that Israel was destroyed. So we have the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And then in AD 70, we have the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Later in AD 135, in the second revolt, we have the destruction of Israel again. And all of these events, when you look at the final event that marked the absolute destruction of the Jewish nation and the city of Jerusalem, each time, all three times, the event occurred on the 9th day of the month of Av on the Jewish calendar. So I thought that was an interesting point, and I wanted to include that in the slide here. All right, next time we're going to tie all these events together, and we're going to look at how they relate to prophecy, particularly Matthew 24 and some passages in Revelation. So I hope you join me next time, and thank you for watching this presentation.